Amidst the lights and applause of a grand talent show, a barefoot girl approaches the stage holding a worn violin. Between laughter and scornful glances, she makes a simple request, a plate of food, if she played well. When the bow touches the strings, silence falls over the auditorium, and each note reveals more pain and truth than 1,000 words. That night, no one left the same. The girl's hunger transformed into the most moving sound the audience had ever heard. The morning sun gilded the horizon over Cornwall as Eleanor Vance stepped out of the taxi in front of the imposing wrought-iron gates. The Davenport estate rose majestically on the hilltop, with a privileged view of the sea. Eleanor took a deep breath, adjusted the backpack on her shoulder, and rang the bell. She was nervous, but she needed this job. A week earlier, she had been lying on the tiny sofa of her flat in Camden, staring blankly at the peeling ceiling, when her mobile phone rang. It was Chloe, her old classmate from her psychology degree, which she had abandoned to work as a nanny. "Eleanor, I have an offer you can't refuse. A super-rich businessman urgently needs a nanny for his children. 7-year-old triplets. The salary is 3 times what you're making at that school. They're desperate." Now standing before this seaside palace, Eleanor questioned whether she had made the right choice. She knew almost nothing about her employer, only that he was Julian Davenport, a widower and owner of one of the largest luxury hotel chains in the UK, and that in 3 days he would be getting married again. The intercom crackled. "Yes?" "Eleanor Vance, the new nanny. I have an interview scheduled for 9 o'clock. The gates buzzed open electronically. Eleanor walked through the extensive, impeccably manicured garden, where gardeners worked in silence. Ahead of her, the 3-story white mansion gleamed like a pearl in the sun. Dozens of people were bustling about, carrying flowers, fabrics, and furniture. The wedding preparations were in full swing. A woman with grey hair and an erect posture appeared at the main door. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Mr. Davenport is waiting for you in his study." Eleanor followed the woman through a marble foyer, with a chandelier that looked as if it were made of crystal tears. They climbed a curved staircase and walked down a corridor decorated with paintings of the Scottish Highlands. Mrs. Gable knocked discreetly on a dark wooden door. "Come in," a male voice commanded from the other side. The study was spacious, with large windows that framed the sea like living paintings. Behind a rosewood desk, a man of about 40, with brown hair slightly grey at the temples, was staring intently at a laptop screen. "Sir, Miss Vance is here." Julian Davenport raised his brown eyes, tired but piercing. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable." The housekeeper left silently, closing the door. Julian gestured to an armchair in front of the desk. "Please, have a seat. I apologize for the rush and the chaos. As you can imagine, this isn't the best week for interviews." "I understand perfectly," Eleanor replied, sitting with her back straight. "I appreciate the opportunity." Julian closed the laptop and sighed. "I'll be direct, Miss Vance. I need someone to start immediately. My children, the triplets, are temporarily at their maternal aunt's house, my sister-in-law Catherine in the countryside in the Cotswolds. They will return in a week after my wedding and honeymoon. I want you to be ready for when they get back." Eleanor nodded, somewhat confused. If the children weren't at home, why the urgency to hire her before the wedding? "Of course. May I see their room? To familiarize myself with the space and prepare some activities for when they arrive." A slight discomfort flickered across Julian's face. "Certainly. Mrs. Gable will show you everything. The triplets are special. Leo and Noah are very close, almost inseparable. Sophie is more independent, but extremely sensitive. They lost their mother when they were only 3. Cancer." "I'm very sorry," Eleanor said with sincerity. "It was difficult for all of us." Julian stood up, indicating that the formal interview was over. "Your CV is impressive. Chloe recommended you enthusiastically. Considering the situation, I'm prepared to hire you immediately. The room next to the triplets will be yours. Mrs. Gable will show you everything." "Thank you for your trust, Mr. Davenport. You won't regret it." As Eleanor was leaving the study, Julian added, "Oh, Miss Vance, my fiancée, Victoria, is extremely busy with the preparations. Please, avoid bothering her with questions about the children. Any queries, direct them to me or Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable was waiting in the corridor and led Eleanor to the second floor of the mansion to a door decorated with 3 colorful stars. This is their room, the housekeeper explained, opening the door. The room was spacious and bright, with 3 beds arranged in a triangular formation. One wall was entirely covered by a bookshelf filled with children's books and toys, organized by color. There was a central table with drawing materials and 3 different chairs, 1 blue, 1 green, and 1 pink. Eleanor noticed that despite the room's impeccable appearance, there was something strangely untouched about it, as if it were a film set and not a place actually inhabited by children. "Here is your room," said Mrs. Gable, showing her a smaller, but equally elegant room, connected to the children's room by a discreet door. "Have your bags arrived?" "Yes, they're downstairs. I'll have someone bring them up. Lunch is served at noon. Dinner is at 8. Mr. Davenport rarely joins us at the table these days. Miss Victoria usually eats in her room." Mrs. Gable spoke mechanically, as if reciting memorized rules. "Mrs. Gable, do the triplets call often? I'd like to speak with them before they return to get to know them a little." The housekeeper hesitated almost imperceptibly. "The children are in a rural area, miss. The phone signal is poor. Miss Catherine sends news occasionally." When she was alone, Eleanor walked through the children's room, touching the objects, trying to form a mental image of her new charges. On the chest of drawers was a photo frame with a picture of the triplets, 2 identical boys with brown hair and a girl with long dark curls, all with the same almond-shaped eyes as their father. She turned the photo over and saw an inscription. "Leo, Noah, and Sophie, 7 years old." The children were smiling, but their eyes seemed sad. Eleanor opened the drawers of the chests. All were full of neatly folded clothes. She examined the wardrobe, dozens of children's outfits organized by color, shoes lined up in rows. Everything seemed strangely complete for children who were supposedly traveling. The bedroom door opened abruptly, making Eleanor jump. A tall, slender woman with perfectly straightened blonde hair and flawless makeup stood in the doorway. She wore a tailored white suit and very high heels. Her blue eyes, cold as ice, examined Eleanor from head to toe. "You must be the new nanny," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "Eleanor Vance." "Victoria Sterling." "Soon to be Victoria Davenport." She entered the room, her heels clicking on the fine wood floor. "I imagine Julian has explained everything." "Yes, about the children being with their aunt." Victoria interrupted her with a gesture. "Exactly. And it's better this way. Children and weddings don't mix, do they? All that noise, that commotion." She ran her hand over the surface of the chest of drawers, as if checking for dust. "Julian is a wonderful man, but being a father has softened him. Those 3 are complicated, especially the girl." "Sophie?" Eleanor asked, remembering the photo. "Yes, that's the one. She has a far too vivid imagination, if you know what I mean." Victoria moved closer to Eleanor, invading her personal space. Her perfume was intoxicating and suffocating. "I hope you'll be firm with them when they return. I will not tolerate indiscipline or fabrications after the wedding." "Certainly, ma'am. I have experience with children of all personalities." Victoria smiled again, this time showing her perfectly aligned teeth. "Excellent. Because here at the Davenport estate everyone must know their place, including the children, and including the nanny." Without waiting for a response, Victoria spun on her heels and left, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and veiled threats. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Something in that house deeply unsettled her. The silence was disturbing, almost as if the mansion were holding its breath, waiting. She got up and opened the window, watching the full moon reflected on the sea. So close and yet so far. She decided to explore. She put on a robe over her pajamas and went out into the corridor. The mansion was silent, except for the occasional noise from workers who, even at this late hour, were continuing the wedding preparations in the garden. She went down the stairs, avoiding the steps that seemed to creak. The foyer was lit only by the moonlight streaming through the high windows. She walked towards the kitchen, thinking of getting a glass of water, when she heard voices coming from Julian's study. "We can't postpone it any longer," Victoria's voice said, tense and controlled. "The boarding school in Switzerland is already confirmed. 3 places, as we requested." "But they're so young," Julian replied, his voice tired. "And we haven't even consulted them about it." "Julian, darling, we've discussed this. They need discipline, structure. Something that you, with all due respect, haven't been able to provide since Isabel left us. Perhaps we should wait a little longer. I've hired a new nanny. She seems competent." "A nanny is no substitute for a formal education," Victoria cut in. "Besides, she's temporary. Our life together is just beginning. Do you really want 3 boisterous children running around the house while we're adjusting as a couple?" There was a long silence. "Is Catherine taking good care of them?" Julian finally asked. "Of course she is. You know your sister-in-law, she adores them." Victoria's voice softened. "Come to bed, darling. We have a big day ahead of us tomorrow." Eleanor retreated silently, her heart pounding. Something was wrong, very wrong. Why plan for a boarding school in Switzerland without consulting the children? Why such a rush? And why hire a nanny if the triplets were going to be sent away? As she made her way back to her room, a sense of unease grew in her chest. The mansion's corridors seemed longer and darker. As she passed the triplets' room again, she stopped. She was sure she had heard something, a sound so faint it could have been her imagination. She slowly opened the door to the children's room and went inside. The moonlight bathed the 3 empty beds. Everything was silent again. Perhaps she was becoming paranoid. It was then that she heard it, a faint scratching sound like fingernails against wood. And then, so low she could barely distinguish it. "Is anyone there?" The voice was childish, muffled, and seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Eleanor froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She was not alone in the room. And the children, the triplets who were supposedly miles away at their aunt's house in the Cotswolds, seemed much closer than anyone imagined. Eleanor remained motionless, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her eyes swept the room, searching for the source of that childish voice. The silence returned, so thick she could hear it buzzing in her ears. "Hello?" she whispered, so softly she could barely hear her own voice. "Is anyone here?" For long seconds, nothing happened. Then again, the sound of fingernails scratching wood. This time, Eleanor managed to pinpoint the direction. It was coming from the large Baroque painting on the east wall of the room, an imposing piece depicting a landscape of the Scottish Highlands. She approached cautiously, her bare feet silent on the fine wood floor. When she was inches from the painting, the voice whispered again, "Are you the new lady who's going to look after us?" It was a girl's voice, fragile and insecure. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine. "Sophie?" she ventured, remembering the name of the girl in the photo. An audible sigh came from behind the painting. "She knows my name," the childish voice murmured, apparently to someone else. "Daddy told her about us. Sophie, where are you? What's happening?" Eleanor touched the frame of the painting, feeling it was strangely loose. "We can't talk loud," Sophie replied, her voice now almost inaudible. "She'll hear. She said if we talked to anyone, we'd never see Daddy again." "Who said that, Victoria?" Eleanor pressed, her stomach tightening with a bad feeling. "Silence. Sophie, please. I'm here to help. Where are your brothers?" "Here," answered a different voice, deeper but just as childish. "We're all here." Eleanor examined the painting more closely. It was huge from floor to ceiling and seemed out of place. She ran her fingers along the edges and felt a crack. It wasn't just a painting, but a disguised door. "Are you locked in there? How do I open this?" "You can't," replied the second voice, which Eleanor presumed belonged to one of the boys. She put the bolt on the outside and pushed a heavy piece of furniture against the door. "We've tried, but we can't get out. How long have you been in there?" Eleanor asked, a lump forming in her throat. "Many days," said a third, weaker voice. "We've lost count. It's dark. We're thirsty." Eleanor felt a wave of panic. The children were dehydrated, hungry, and terrified. "I'm going to get you out, I promise. But I need to be careful." "If Victoria finds out—" "No," Sophie interrupted, her voice rising slightly before dropping back to a whisper. "She's dangerous. She said she'd send us far away if we told anyone. To a place where we'd never see Daddy again." Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. She needed a plan. "Listen, I'm going to get you some water and food. Is there a gap I can pass it through?" "Nuts, there's a small opening in the skirting board," one of the boys replied. "On the right side of the painting." Eleanor knelt down and, feeling along the skirting board, found an opening the size of her hand. She could see only darkness on the other side. "I'll be back in a few minutes. Don't make any noise, okay?" 3 voices whispered in agreement. Eleanor stood up and left the room silently, her mind racing. She went down to the kitchen, where she grabbed a bottle of water, some apples, bread, and cheese, foods that wouldn't make noise when eaten. As she returned to the room, she heard voices coming from the corridor. Quickly, she hid the food under her robe and leaned against the wall, trying to look casual. Victoria and a man in a suit were walking towards her, engrossed in a conversation about the floral arrangements for the wedding. When they saw Eleanor, they stopped abruptly. "Miss Vance," said Victoria, her cold smile contrasting with her sharp gaze. "Insomnia on your first night?" "Yes, new house, different bed," Eleanor replied, forcing a smile. "I came down for some water." Victoria studied her for a moment, her piercing blue eyes seeming to read her thoughts. "I understand. But try to get some rest. The next few days will be hectic. Frederick, continue showing me the details of the buffet." They walked away, and Eleanor released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Quickly, she returned to the children's room and knelt again by the skirting board. "It's me," she whispered. "I brought water and food." Small hands appeared in the opening. Eleanor passed the water bottle through first, hearing the eager sound of swallowing from the other side. Then she cut the bread and cheese into small pieces and pushed them through the gap, followed by the apples. "Eat slowly," she instructed. "How long has it been since you had food?" "Aunt Victoria gave us a little water yesterday," Sophie replied between bites. "Food, it's been 3 days." Eleanor felt her blood boil. 3 days without food. 7-year-old children. How did this happen? Why did she do this to you? There was a pause, and then Leo, Eleanor could now distinguish their voices, began to explain. "It was after Daddy said we were going to Switzerland. Sophie cried a lot and said she didn't want to go. Noah and I said we didn't either. Daddy looked sad, but Aunt Victoria got angry. She waited for Daddy to leave on a trip," Noah continued, his voice a little hoarser than his brother's. "She said she had a surprise for us. She brought us here and showed us this secret door. She said it was a magical place, a special hideout. She said it was just a game," Sophie added, her voice choked with emotion. "That we should go inside and see what was there. But when we went in, she closed the door and said we'd stay here until we learned to behave. Then she told Daddy we were at Aunt Catherine's house," said Leo. "We heard her on the phone with him. She said we had asked to go because we didn't want to get in the way of the wedding." "We tried to shout," Noah explained, "but this place is like a box. No one can hear us outside. And Aunt Victoria said that if we told anyone, she'd send us to a place much worse than Switzerland." Eleanor felt a deep indignation rising in her chest. The situation was absurd, cruel, inhuman. Did Julian Davenport really not realize his children were missing? How could a father not notice the absence of his own children for days? "I'm going to get you out of there," Eleanor promised. "But I need to be smart. If we try now, Victoria might find out and do something worse." "The wedding is the day after tomorrow," Sophie said. "She's going to take us away after. We heard her on the phone talking about a place called Le Rocher." Eleanor recognized the name. It was one of the most exclusive and isolated boarding schools in Switzerland. Victoria was planning to get rid of the children for good. "I won't let that happen," Eleanor assured them. "Trust me. Tomorrow I'll bring more food and water, and we'll come up with a plan." "Do you promise you won't tell her you found us?" Sophie pleaded. "I promise. Now try to rest. I'll stay here in the room keeping watch. If you need anything, just scratch the wall lightly." Throughout the night, Eleanor stayed awake, sitting in an armchair in the children's room, watching the painting that concealed the triplets. Her mind worked frantically, weighing her options. She could confront Julian immediately, but what if he didn't believe her? After all, it was her word, a newly hired nanny, against his fiancé's. She could call the police, but without concrete proof, they might not believe her either. And Victoria would surely have time to concoct a story, or, worse, remove the children from there. She needed a foolproof plan, and above all, she needed to ensure the triplets' safety. The next morning, Eleanor was summoned to Julian's study. He looked even more tired than the day before, with deep dark circles under his brown eyes. "Miss Vance, how was your first night?" "Quiet, Mr. Davenport," Eleanor lied, carefully studying his reactions. I was thinking about the triplets. I'd like to know more about them, their personalities, their preferences. Julian smiled slightly, but his eyes remained sad. The boys, Leo and Noah, are like two peas in a pod, but with completely different personalities. Leo is the leader, always looking out for his brother. Noah is more sensitive, artistic. Sophie, he hesitated. Sophie is extraordinary, too smart for her age, observant. Sometimes I think she sees things no one else does. They sound like wonderful children, Eleanor commented genuinely. You must miss them. A flash of pain crossed Julian's face. Yes, but they need stability. Victoria believes an international boarding school will provide that. Structure, discipline, and what do you believe? Eleanor ventured. Julian seemed surprised by the direct question. Me? Well, I don't have much experience raising children. Isabel, my late wife, was the one who truly understood the triplets. Since she passed, I've been doing the best I can, but I'm sure you have, Eleanor interrupted gently, and I bet your children know that too. Julian stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to decipher something in her words. Miss Vance, something tells me you're going to be exactly what my children need. He sighed, checking his watch. Unfortunately, I have a meeting with the wedding planner now. Feel free to explore the house and familiarize yourself with everything. Mrs. Gable can assist you with whatever you need. As Julian left, Eleanor decided to investigate further. She needed to understand who Victoria Sterling was and what she was really planning. She went up to the third floor where, according to Mrs. Gable's casual mention, the bride's suite was located. The corridor was empty, all staff busy with preparations downstairs and in the gardens. Eleanor found the suite door ajar, and after checking that no one was around, slipped inside silently. The room was extravagant. A king-size bed covered in white silk, Italian designer furniture, a walk-in wardrobe larger than Eleanor's entire flat in Camden. On a glass desk, an open laptop displayed a screensaver with photos of Victoria at various social events, always stunning, always the center of attention. Eleanor hesitated. She was invading her employer's privacy, something that could cost her the job, and the chance to help the triplets. But what was at stake was far greater than her professional ethics. Children were locked up, hungry and terrified just a few meters away. With trembling fingers, she moved the laptop's mouse. The screen lit up, showing Victoria's email inbox was open. A recent message caught her eye. From La Roche International Institute. Subject enrollment confirmation. Davenport students. Dear Ms. Sterling, we confirm receipt of the full deposit for the enrollment of the 3 students, Leo, Noah, and Sophie Davenport. As requested, the full boarding term will commence on an urgent basis starting next week. We remind you that, according to our institution's policies, students on the full boarding program are entitled to only 2 family visits per year. During predetermined periods, Eleanor felt her stomach sink. Victoria wasn't just planning to send the children away. She was effectively isolating them from their father and anyone who could help them. She continued exploring the emails and found another, even more disturbing one, from Dr. Mark Jennings, subject, Preliminary Report, Davenport Children. As per our conversation, the document sent suggests the triplets present with challenging and potentially disruptive behavior, which would justify the intensive therapeutic approach we discussed. However, I must stress that without a face-to-face assessment, I cannot issue a formal diagnosis. The notes you shared regarding the girls' fabulous tendencies and the boys' oppositional behavior are not sufficient to... Victoria was fabricating psychological problems to justify sending the children away. Eleanor quickly took photos of the emails on her phone and continued her search. In a desk drawer, she found a folder with documents for international transfer of minors and a dossier on Julian Davenport, detailing his assets, investments, and the will he had made after his wife's death, in which the triplets were the main heirs to the family fortune, with a clause ensuring that the surviving spouse would manage everything until the children came of age. The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. Victoria didn't just want to get rid of the children, she wanted control over the Davenport fortune, and she was willing to do anything to get it. A noise in the corridor alerted Eleanor. She quickly closed the drawer and left the suite, almost colliding with Mrs. Gable, who was carrying a stack of towels. "Miss Vance, what were you doing in Miss Sterling's suite?" "I'm sorry, Mrs. Gable. I'm exploring the house to get my bearings and I got lost." "These corridors are a maze." The housekeeper studied her with evident suspicion. "The third floor is exclusively for Mr. Davenport and his fiancée. The staff quarters are on the first floor, west wing." "I understand. It won't happen again." As she went downstairs, Eleanor felt Mrs. Gable's gaze fixed on her back. She would have to be more careful. It was clear now that Victoria posed a real danger to the triplets, and possibly to anyone who interfered with her plans. In the kitchen, she took advantage of the commotion of preparations for that evening's rehearsal dinner and discreetly set aside more food for the children. She went up to the triplets' room and, making sure no one was watching, fed the little ones again through the gap in the skirting board. "I've discovered her plan," she whispered to the children as they ate ravenously. "She wants to send you to a boarding school in Switzerland and stop you from seeing your father." "Why does she hate us so much?" Sophie asked, her voice choked. "It's not hate, Sophie. It's greed. She wants your father's money and you're an obstacle to that." "What are we going to do?" asked Leo, assuming his natural role as leader even in this desperate situation. Eleanor took a deep breath before answering. "Tomorrow is the wedding. So I'm going to get you out of there during the ceremony, when everyone is in the garden. But we have to be perfect in our execution. One mistake and Victoria could do something even worse." "We're scared," admitted Noah, the quietest of the three. "I know, sweetie. But I'm a teacher, remember? And what's the #1 rule of the classroom?" There was a moment of silence, and then Sophie replied, an audible smile in her voice. "Always raise your hand before you speak." Eleanor laughed softly. "That's #2. #1 is the teacher always protects her students. Always." From the other side of the wall, 3 pairs of small hands reached through the gap, seeking human touch, the comfort that had been denied them for days. Eleanor held those trembling little hands, vowing to herself that, whatever happened, these children would never feel fear or abandonment again. The day dawned with a fine rain over Cornwall, silver drops sliding down the enormous windows of the Davenport mansion. Eleanor hadn't slept. She had spent the entire night planning every detail of the rescue operation, anticipating obstacles, creating backup plans, and talking to the triplets, telling them stories to keep them calm, making silent promises of safety that she prayed she could keep. The mansion was buzzing with final preparations. The wedding was set for 5 in the afternoon, when the rain was supposed to let up. Staff hurried back and forth, carrying arrangements of white flowers, installing lights, and setting up the hundreds of chairs in the immense gazebo built especially for the occasion in the gardens. Eleanor used the chaos to explore the house in more detail. She needed to find a way to open the secret door in the children's room. During her discreet investigation, she discovered that the mansion had a complex system of service passages, narrow corridors, secondary staircases, and camouflage doors that allowed staff to move about without being seen by the residents and guests. It was in one of these passages that she finally found what she was looking for, the other side of the secret door that held the triplets captive. The service corridor was dark and dusty, clearly seldom used. At the end of it, a heavy wooden door was blocked by an old chest of drawers. With effort, Eleanor managed to move the piece of furniture a few inches, just enough to see the door's lock. She would need a key or something to force it open. "I'm getting you out today," she promised in a whisper, pressing her mouth to the crack in the door. During the ceremony, "She came to visit us last night," came Leo's weak voice. "She said that after the wedding we're going to a special place." "Don't worry. I won't let that happen." Eleanor returned to her quarters to prepare for the day. As part of the house staff, she would wear a formal uniform during the ceremony, a navy blue blazer, a white shirt, and black trousers. As she dressed, she mentally reviewed her plan. The ceremony was scheduled for 5 in the afternoon. The cocktail party and reception would follow in the mansion's grand hall. At 8, dinner would be served, followed by a party until the early hours. Julian and Victoria would leave for their honeymoon at 6 the next morning, on a private jet. The ideal moment for the rescue would be during the exchange of vows, when all eyes, including those of the security guards, would be on the bride and groom. Eleanor would have approximately 20 minutes to get the triplets and bring them to Julian. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said, finishing buttoning her blazer. Mrs. Gable appeared, her usually impassive face showing signs of tension. "Miss Sterling requests your presence in the bridal suite, immediately." Eleanor felt a chill. Had Victoria discovered something? Had Mrs. Gable reported her for snooping? "I'm on my way." She went up to the third floor with her heart pounding. The suite door was open. Inside, a team of makeup artists and hairdressers were working on Victoria, who was seated before a dressing table worthy of a Hollywood star's dressing room. "Miss Vance, come in," Victoria ordered, her eyes meeting Eleanor's in the mirror's reflection. "Close the door." Eleanor obeyed, staying close to the exit. Victoria dismissed the professionals with a gesture. "5 minutes, please. I need to discuss domestic matters." When they were alone, Victoria swiveled in her chair, facing Eleanor directly. She was stunning, even with her hair only partially styled and her makeup incomplete. "Mrs. Gable informed me that you have been exploring restricted areas of the house. As I mentioned to her, I got lost. The mansion is enormous." "Of course," Victoria smiled coldly. "And I suppose you also got lost on my laptop yesterday?" Eleanor felt the blood freeze in her veins, but she kept her face impassive. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Miss Sterling, please." Victoria stood up, her white silk robe floating around her like a poisonous cloud. "I'm more observant than you think. The cursor was on a different email when I returned. An email that conveniently mentioned the triplets." Eleanor decided to change tactics. Denial was useless. "I'm concerned about the children. Mr. Davenport hired me to care for them, but it seems you have other plans." "My plans for the children are none of your concern." Victoria's voice was controlled, almost polite, but her eyes were glacial. "You were hired to follow instructions, not to question family decisions. Decisions that the children's father is unaware of." Victoria narrowed her eyes. "Be careful, Miss Vance, you're treading on dangerous ground." She moved closer, stopping inches from Eleanor. "People who interfere with my plans tend to regret it, deeply." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm clarifying the situation. Julian may be a brilliant businessman, but he's naive in personal matters. He believes what I say because he wants to believe it. He wants a perfect family, a life without complications. And the children are complications." "Exactly." Victoria smiled as if Eleanor had finally understood something obvious. "Those 3 are as stubborn as their mother. Isabel was always an obstacle. Her absence was convenient." Eleanor felt a shiver. The insinuation was disturbing. "What exactly are you saying?" "Nothing that can be proven." Victoria shrugged elegantly. "Now let's clarify your position here. You have 2 options: cooperate and be generously rewarded, or interfere and suffer the consequences." "What kind of reward?" Victoria's eyes glinted with interest. "Clever. Always good to negotiate." She returned to the dressing table and opened a drawer, taking out an envelope. £100,000 in cash. Your passports to Switzerland are already arranged. You will accompany the triplets as their official guardian and receive a monthly salary 3 times what was agreed with Julian." Eleanor took the envelope, feeling the weight of the money. It was a sum that would completely change her financial life. "And if I refuse, have you considered how difficult it will be to find a job after I accuse you of trying to kidnap the triplets? Or worse, of child abuse?" Victoria raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "I have fabricated evidence for any necessary scenario." Eleanor stared at the envelope in her hands, pretending to consider the offer. "When would I need to give you my answer?" "Now would be ideal. But I understand it's an important decision." Victoria consulted the delicate watch on her wrist. "You have until the end of the ceremony, approximately 6 o'clock. And the children? Where are they, really? Safe? That's all you need to know for now." Victoria gestured towards the door. "You may leave. And remember, £100,000 buys a lot of comfort and silence." Eleanor left the suite with the envelope in her hands, her mind working frantically. Victoria suspected her, but she didn't know that she had already found the children. That still gave her some advantage. She returned to her room, hid the envelope under the mattress, and went downstairs to continue her discreet preparations. In the kitchen, she took advantage of the chaos to grab more food and water for the triplets. While watching the party staff come and go, She noticed a toolbox left near the service entrance. Discreetly, she took a screwdriver and hid it in the inside pocket of her blazer. Time passed quickly. At 3 o'clock, the first guests began to arrive. Men in expensive suits and women in designer dresses populated the gardens, champagne flutes in hand, rehearsed smiles on their faces. Photographers circulated, capturing every detail of what promised to be the wedding of the year. Eleanor took advantage of a moment of distraction to return to the children's room. Kneeling by the skirting board, she passed more food and water through the gap. "Listen carefully," she whispered urgently. "I'm getting you out of there today. When the ceremony begins, I'll be in the service corridor on the other side of the door. I'm going to open it, but you need to be ready to leave in absolute silence. Understood?" "Yes," replied 3 voices in unison. "I'm so scared," admitted Sophie. "I know, sweetie. But I'm a teacher, remember? And teachers always keep their promises." "And then, where are we going?" asked Leo, always practical. "Straight to your father. In front of all the guests. Victoria won't be able to do anything with so many witnesses." "What if Daddy doesn't believe us?" Noah's voice trembled. "He always believes her." Eleanor hesitated. It was a legitimate concern. Julian seemed completely under Victoria's spell. "He will believe you, because the truth has a power that no lie possesses." At 4:30, Eleanor was strategically positioned in the garden, watching the guests take their seats. The sky had cleared, as promised by the meteorologists hired especially for the event. A string quartet played softly, creating the desired romantic atmosphere. Julian stood at the altar, elegant in his tuxedo, talking to his best man, a grey-haired man Eleanor recognized from the news as an influential member of Parliament. The groom looked nervous, constantly adjusting his bow tie and checking his watch. At 5 o'clock sharp, the bridal march began. The guests rose, mobile phones at the ready to record the bride's entrance. All eyes turned to the start of the white runner that cut through the garden. This was the moment Eleanor had been waiting for. Discreetly, she moved away, entering the mansion through the service doors. The corridors were deserted. Even the staff had been instructed to watch the ceremony to ensure everything went perfectly. Eleanor ran to the service corridor, mentally thanking herself for having explored the house and memorized the routes. She reached the locked door and with the screwdriver began to work on the lock. Her hands trembled slightly, but years of helping her father with small home repairs now proved useful. After what felt like endless minutes of trying, the lock gave way with a soft click. Eleanor pushed the heavy wooden door open and was met by 3 pairs of wide eyes shining in the gloom of the hideout. "Eleanor!" Sophie sobbed, throwing herself into her arms. The boys followed, clinging to her legs as if they feared she was an apparition that might vanish at any moment. They were pale, with deep dark circles under their eyes, and visibly thinner than in the photographs, but they were alive. "Alive and now free." "Quietly," Eleanor whispered, hugging all 3 at once. "We don't have much time." She quickly surveyed the space where they had been confined. It was a small, stuffy, windowless room, probably an old pantry. There were food scraps on the floor, empty water bottles, and in the corner a bucket that served as a makeshift toilet. The sight broke her heart. "Can you walk?" she asked, noticing how weak they were. "Yes," replied Leo, once again taking on the role of leader. "We're ready." Eleanor guided the triplets through the service corridors, stopping at every corner to check if the path was clear. The sounds of the ceremony reached them, muffled. From the garden, the celebrant's voice, occasional responses from the bride and groom. Applause from the guests. When they neared the door that led to the garden, Eleanor crouched down to be at the children's eye level. "Listen carefully. We're going to interrupt the ceremony. I know you're scared, but you need to be brave. Run straight to your father and don't leave his side no matter what happens. Understood?" 3 heads nodded in agreement. Their faces were determined despite their evident fear. On 3. 1, 2. "What do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Gable's sharp voice froze them. The housekeeper was standing at the end of the corridor, her wide eyes fixed on the triplets. "Children? But how? You're supposed to be with your aunt." Eleanor placed herself protectively in front of the triplets. They were never with their aunt, Mrs. Gable. Victoria locked them in a secret room for over a week. They were hungry, dehydrated, terrified. Mrs. Gable's expression shifted from shock to horror. That's not possible." Miss Sterling said. She lied. To everyone, including Mr. Davenport. For a tense moment, Eleanor feared Mrs. Gable would raise an alarm, call security, alert Victoria. Instead, the housekeeper approached slowly and knelt before the children. Is it true, little ones? Did she do this to you? Sophie, always the most expressive of the three, let the tears roll freely. She said we were a problem, Connie, that Daddy didn't want us anymore. The use of the affectionate nickname seemed to break something inside the housekeeper. Her hardened face softened and she gently touched Sophie's cheek. Oh my God, all this time. I should have realized. The calls that never went through, the clothes that stayed in the drawers. She raised her eyes to Eleanor, a sudden determination hardening her features. What do you plan to do? Take the children to Julian. In front of everyone. Victoria won't be able to hide this or create more lies. Mrs. Gable nodded. I'll help you. The ceremony is almost over. The vows have been exchanged. Now the celebrant is asking the traditional question about impediments. It was the perfect moment, almost scripted. Let's go, said Eleanor, picking up Sophie and holding out her hands to the boys. Together, the five of them left through the service doors and discreetly skirted the garden, approaching the side of the altar. The celebrant's voice carried clearly over the sound system. If anyone knows any reason why this couple should not be joined in holy matrimony, let him speak now or forever hold his peace. Eleanor exchanged a meaningful look with Mrs. Gable, who nodded encouragingly. It was time to act. Go, she whispered to the triplets, giving them a gentle push towards the altar. Run to your father, now. Leo was the first to move, immediately followed by Noah. Sophie hesitated for just a second before following them. The three emerged from the side of the garden like little ghosts, running down the white runner towards the altar. Daddy, Sophie shouted, her childish voice cutting through the reverent silence that had followed the celebrant's question. 200 heads turned simultaneously. A murmur of confusion spread through the guests. At the altar, Julian Davenport froze, his face shifting from surprise to absolute shock in a matter of seconds. Leo? Noah? Sophie? His voice failed him. How? Weren't you with Catherine? Victoria, stunning in her crystal-covered white dress, turned slowly, her face a mask of controlled horror. Her eyes met Eleanor's, who was now advancing down the runner behind the children, and a silent understanding passed between them. Julian, darling, Victoria tried to intervene, her voice sweet as poison. The children were supposed to be... Daddy! Leo reached his father first, clinging to his legs. She locked us up. We were trapped this whole time. Noah and Sophie reached him seconds later, the three of them now hugging Julian's legs, who seemed unable to process what was happening. What are you talking about? Locked up where? Who? Her. Sophie pointed at Victoria, her small finger trembling. Aunt Victoria locked us in the secret room behind the wall. She said we were a problem and that you didn't want us anymore. The nearest guests heard everything. Expressions of shock and horror spreading like waves. Cameras and mobile phones were pointed at the scene, capturing every moment of the wedding disaster. Julian looked from his children to Victoria, his face losing all color. Is it true? He asked, his voice just a whisper. Did you do this? Julian! Victoria laughed nervously, trying to maintain her composure. Don't be ridiculous. They're children. They have vivid imaginations. They obviously ran away from Catherine's house and made up this absurd story because they didn't want the wedding. Catherine has been in Europe for 2 months, said a female voice from among the guests. A middle-aged woman stood up, her face contorted with outrage. I'm her cousin. We video-chatted yesterday. She hasn't seen the children since their birthday. A buzz went through the assembly. Victoria paled visibly under her perfect makeup. Eleanor approached, stopping beside the triplets. Mr. Davenport, I'm Eleanor Vance, the nanny you hired. I found your children last night, locked in a secret room behind the wall of their bedroom. They were hungry, dehydrated, terrified. Your fiancé was planning to send them to a boarding school in Switzerland right after the wedding, under a regime of almost total isolation. Julian looked at his children, really seeing them for the first time since Eleanor had arrived at the mansion. He noticed the dark circles, the paleness, their thinner bodies, the rumpled clothes. My children, how did I not see? His voice broke, laden with guilt and horror. You believed her lies, replied Leo without accusation, merely stating a fact. She said we were fine and you believed her. Julian fell to his knees, hugging the triplets tightly, tears streaming freely down his face. Forgive me. Please forgive me. Victoria backed away slowly, her eyes calculating escape routes, but there was nowhere to go. Outraged guests formed a human barrier. At the back of the garden, 2 security guards were already approaching, alerted by Mrs. Gable. This is absurd, Victoria tried one last time, her voice losing its artificial sweetness. A conspiracy against me. This nanny manipulated everything. The only manipulator here is you, replied Mrs. Gable, advancing down the runner with a folder in her hand. I kept copies of all your emails, Miss Sterling, about boarding schools, about falsifying psychological reports, about Mr. Davenport's will. I knew something wasn't right, but I never thought you were capable of harming the children. The security guards reached Victoria, who had now abandoned any pretense of innocence. You don't understand, she hissed, her eyes fixed on Julian. I would have been the perfect wife. We would have built an empire together, but those brats were always in the way, always there reminding you of her. Julian rose slowly, his face transformed by a cold fury. You hurt them. My children. The only thing that matters to me in this world. His voice was low, controlled, but it carried a promise of consequences. Get out of my house now. The guards will escort you to the police station. And believe me, I will use every penny of my fortune to ensure that you never come near my family again. As Victoria was led away, shouting threats and accusations, Julian turned back to Eleanor, still kneeling at the children's level. How can I thank you? You saved my children. You don't need to thank me. Mr. Davenport, I only did what any decent person would do. Sophie, exhausted but finally safe, rested her head on her father's shoulder and smiled at Eleanor. You kept your promise. Teachers always keep their promises. Around them, the most anticipated wedding of the year had transformed into something completely different. The reunion of a father with his children, the painful discovery of a betrayal, and the birth of a new understanding of what truly mattered. The hours that followed the confrontation at the altar were a whirlwind. The guests dispersed amidst scandalized murmurs and frantic phone calls. Security teams cleared the mansion. Doctors were called to examine the triplets, while lawyers came and went from Julian's study at regular intervals. Eleanor remained by the children's side throughout the process. Sitting on the edge of the bed in the makeshift hospital room in one of the mansion's suites, she held Sophie's small hands while the doctor checked her vital signs. Moderate dehydration, some superficial abrasions, possible anemia from malnutrition, diagnosed the doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and steady hands. Nothing that good care, proper nutrition and rest won't fix in a few days. Physically, at least. This last observation was directed discreetly at Julian, who stood by the door, his face a mask of guilt and concern. And what about the other aspect? He asked hesitantly. I recommend psychological counseling, the doctor replied, closing her bag. Traumatic experiences like this leave scars. I'll refer you to a colleague who specializes in childhood trauma. When the doctor left, a heavy silence fell over the room. The triplets, exhausted but resisting sleep as if they feared it was all just a dream, looked alternately at their father and Eleanor. You need to rest, Eleanor said softly, arranging the blankets. It's been a long day. Are you going to stay? Sophie asked, gripping her wrist with sudden urgency. Of course I am. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Promise? Insisted Noah, his voice small and insecure. I promise. Teachers always keep their promises, remember. The three of them visibly relaxed. Julian approached the bed, sitting awkwardly on the opposite edge. Daddy's going to stay too, he said, his voice choked with emotion. Right here. All night. Leo, always the most direct of the three, looked at his father with eyes that seemed much older than his 7 years. Why didn't you notice we were gone, Dad? Why did you believe her and not us? Julian paled as if he had been slapped. Eleanor considered intervening, softening the direct question, but the boy deserved an honest answer. They all did. I failed you, Julian replied after a long moment, unshed tears glistening in his eyes. I have no excuses, only explanations that even I don't accept. I was blind, wanting to believe I had found someone to complete our family. And in that blindness, I forgot to look at what we already had, at the treasure that the three of you are. She said you'd be happy without us, murmured Sophie, snuggling closer to Eleanor. That would never ever be true. Julian hesitantly reached out, touching his daughter's dark curls. You are the reason for my life. I promise I will never fail you like this again. I will never let anyone hurt you or take you away from me again. It was a simple promise, but its weight hung in the air like something tangible. Eleanor felt she was witnessing something deeply intimate, the rebuilding of a family's foundations. Gradually, the triplets' eyelids began to grow heavy. The stress, fear, and relief finally took their toll, and one by one they succumbed to sleep, still clinging to Eleanor's and Julian's hands. When he was sure they were deeply asleep, Julian stood up silently and gestured for Eleanor to follow him to the adjacent balcony. The Cornwall night was starry, the sea gently lapping against the shore in a soothing rhythm. Mr. Davenport, Eleanor began, but he cut her off with a gesture. Julian, please. After what you've done for my family, formalities seem absurd. Julian, she corrected herself. I know this isn't the ideal time, but I feel I need to explain how I found the children and why I acted the way I did. You owe no explanations, he replied, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. But I confess I'm still trying to understand the whole situation. How did you realize something was wrong? Eleanor leaned against the balcony railing, organizing her thoughts. It was small details initially. The impeccably tidy room as if no one really lived in it. All the clothes still in the drawers despite the supposed trip. The lack of communication with the children, she hesitated. And your fiancé, ex-fiancé. There was something in the way she spoke about the children. Like a problem to be solved, Julian concluded bitterly. The police found documents on her laptop. She was planning to send my children to a boarding school in Switzerland, with visits restricted to twice a year. There was even a plan to have them moved to different institutions in different countries after the first year. To separate them and break any resistance, Eleanor added, feeling a chill despite the warm night. All while manipulating me into believing it was for their own good. Julian slammed his fist on the railing. How could I have been so blind? How did I not see? People see what they want to see, especially when they're vulnerable, Eleanor replied softly. You're a widower, raising 3 children alone, trying to rebuild your life. Victoria offered a possibility of completeness. Julian looked at her with surprise. You speak like someone who's been through something similar. Eleanor smiled sadly. Not exactly, but I know vulnerability. I grew up watching my mother accept toxic relationships because she feared loneliness more than she feared suffering. She paused. And I've worked with children long enough to recognize when they are being silenced. They stood in silence for a few minutes, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. What will happen to her? Eleanor finally asked. Victoria? Julian sighed deeply. She's in custody, facing charges of false imprisonment of minors, child cruelty, fraud, and attempted international child abduction. My lawyers have ensured that bail was denied. Her family is in shock, or pretending to be. They were complicit on some level, I'm sure of it. And the triplets? How do you plan to help them overcome this? Honestly, I don't know. Julian looked lost, a far cry from the powerful businessman Eleanor had met 2 days ago. What do you suggest? As a teacher, as someone who has already earned their trust. Eleanor reflected for a moment. They'll need time, patience, and stability. Therapy, certainly. But most of all, they'll need to know that they are heard and taken seriously, that their words have weight. I understand. Julian nodded slowly. And what about you, Miss Vance? Eleanor, what's your plan now? The question took Eleanor by surprise. Amidst the chaos of the last few days, she hadn't stopped to think about what she would do next. I don't know. I was hired as a temporary nanny. Now that the situation has changed— Stay, Julian interrupted him, please. The children trust you in a way they don't trust anyone else right now, not even me. I need your help to rebuild that trust, to help them recover. He hesitated. I need your help too. There was a vulnerability in his voice that touched Eleanor deeply. This powerful man, used to commanding business empires, was admitting that he didn't know how to fix his own family. I'll stay for as long as needed, she replied simply. Thank you. Julian extended his hand, a formal gesture that seemed inadequate for the intimacy of the conversation. Eleanor accepted it anyway, feeling the firmness of his grip. We should try to get some rest now. Tomorrow will be another difficult day. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of low voices. She had fallen asleep in an armchair beside the triplets' bed, who were still sleeping soundly. Julian was at the door talking to a man in a suit, whom Eleanor recognized as one of the lawyers from the previous night. "Good morning," she said, standing up and stretching her sore muscles. "Eleanor," Julian gestured for her to approach, "this is Mr. Davies, my personal solicitor. He needs your statement about everything that happened to formalize the complaint against Victoria." The next few hours were dedicated to official statements, signing documents, and detailed explanations. Eleanor recounted everything, from her arrival at the mansion to the moment of the confrontation at the altar. The solicitor methodically noted every word, occasionally asking questions to clarify a point. "Do you have the envelope with the money that Victoria Sterling offered you?" Mr. Davies asked, adjusting his glasses on his sharp nose. "Yes, it's in my room, hidden under the mattress." "Excellent. That will be crucial evidence of the attempted bribery to cover up the abuse." When the solicitor finally left, Eleanor found Julian on the terrace, talking on the phone. From the tension in his shoulders, the conversation was not pleasant. "No, Catherine, I'm not suggesting you knew," he was saying, rubbing his forehead in frustration. "I'm just informing you of what happened." "Yes, they're physically fine, but shaken." "No, it's not necessary for you to come back from Europe now. Yes, I'll keep you informed." He hung up with a deep sigh. "My sister-in-law," he explained to Eleanor. "Isabel's sister. She's in shock to learn her name was used in the lie. Were she and your late wife close?" "Very. Catherine was our support when Isabel fell ill. She stayed with us until the end." Julian looked at the horizon where the sea met the sky in a perfect line. "She never liked Victoria, said there was something false about her, that I was rushing to replace Isabel. I didn't want to listen." "It's understandable," Eleanor offered. "After such a great loss, it's natural to seek completeness again." Julian turned to face her, his eyes studying her with intensity. How did someone so young become so wise about loss? Eleanor smiled without humor. "I lost my father when I was 12. Cancer, like your wife. I watched my mother try to fill the void with increasingly destructive relationships. Maybe that's why I chose to work with children. They haven't yet learned to hide their wounds, to disguise their needs." A cry from the bedroom interrupted their conversation. Eleanor and Julian rushed inside to find Leo sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with panic. "Daddy!" "Eleanor?" "We're here." Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, gently touching his shoulder. "It was just a nightmare, Leo. You're safe." Noah and Sophie woke up with the commotion, immediately seeking the comforting presence of the adults. "I dreamt she came back," Leo confessed, trembling slightly. "That she took us away again to a dark place where no one could hear us." Julian sat on the other side of the bed, hugging all three children at once. "That will never happen again. I'm here to protect you, and Eleanor is too. You are safe." Breakfast was served in the room, pancakes with chocolate syrup, fresh fruit and orange juice, all served by Mrs. Gable herself, who seemed determined to make up for her failure to notice what was happening under her own roof. "The children need fresh air and sun," Eleanor suggested, observing how the triplets, though still subdued, were already showing signs of physical recovery. "Perhaps a walk in the garden." "Is it safe?" Julian asked, concerned. "The press has been at the gates since yesterday. The scandal has leaked, obviously. The back of the property leads to a private beach, right? We could go that way." So, after breakfast, the five of them followed a paved path that wound through the back gardens of the mansion to a small cove of white sand and crystal-clear water, shielded from prying eyes by natural rock formations. It was a perfect day, with a cobalt-blue sky and a gentle breeze. The triplets, initially hesitant, gradually began to loosen up. Noah was the first to approach the water, letting the gentle waves wash over his feet. Sophie found colorful shells, collecting them like little treasures. Leo, always the protector, kept a close eye on his siblings' movements, as if fearing some danger might appear at any moment. Eleanor and Julian sat on the sand, watching the children a few meters away. "They're extraordinary," Eleanor commented. "The resilience of children is something that never ceases to amaze me. They get that from their mother," Julian replied, a melancholy smile softening his features. Isabel faced her illness with a strength that left me speechless. Until the very last day, she was more concerned with creating good memories with the triplets than with lamenting what she was losing. She must have been an incredible woman. She was. Julian drew idle patterns in the sand. Do you know what's most ironic? Victoria used to say I was still attached to Isabel's ghost, that I needed to move on. But it was precisely in trying to move on that I betrayed everything Isabel stood for, the unconditional protection of the children. Eleanor reflected on this for a moment. I think moving on doesn't mean forgetting or replacing. It means finding a way to carry that love as a part of who you are, not as a burden, but as a strength. Julian looked at her with an expression Eleanor couldn't decipher, something between surprise and recognition. The moment was interrupted by Sophie, who ran up to them with her hands full of shells. Look, Eleanor. This one looks like a heart. She held out a pink, perfectly symmetrical shell. It's beautiful, Sophie. A real treasure. It's for you, the girl declared, placing the shell in Eleanor's palm. To thank you for saving us. Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. Thank you. I'll keep it forever. Does Daddy get one? Julian asked, feigning offense. Sophie considered the question with childlike seriousness. No, you already have us. That's a much bigger treasure. Julian laughed, but his eyes shone with unshed tears. He pulled his daughter into a tight hug, as if fearing she might disappear. The day passed slowly, marked by small moments of normality that felt like miracles after the trauma of the previous days. They had lunch on the beach, a simple picnic brought by Mrs. Gable. The boys built a sandcastle with elaborate towers and moats. Sophie told made-up stories about princesses who saved princes in distress, while Eleanor and Julian listened, commenting at the appropriate moments. However, beneath the apparent tranquility, Eleanor could feel the fragility of the situation. She noticed how the children started at unexpected sounds, how they constantly checked if the adults were still nearby, how they hesitated before moving even a few feet away. The trauma would not disappear in a day or a week. It would be a long process of rebuilding trust. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, they returned to the mansion. The triplets, exhausted from the day outdoors, fell asleep early, this time in Julian's master bedroom, as he had insisted on keeping them as close as possible. Eleanor was on the balcony of her own room, watching the starry sky, when she heard a soft knock on the door. It was Julian holding 2 glasses and a bottle of wine. I thought you might need this as much as I do, he said, holding up the bottle. May I come in? So of course, Eleanor replied, opening the door wider. Julian poured the wine and handed a glass to Eleanor, who accepted it with a grateful smile. Are the children okay? Sleeping soundly. I left the door open to hear if they need anything. He took a sip of wine. The doctor will be back tomorrow, and the child psychologist too. That's a good first step. Julian nodded. Leaning against the balcony railing, Eleanor, I need to ask you something. I'm listening. Why did you stay? Why did you risk so much for children you barely knew, facing such a dangerous situation? He looked at her intently. Victoria could have done something to you. She tried to buy you off, threatened to ruin your reputation, yet you didn't back down. Eleanor considered the question, looking out at the dark sea that reflected the stars. When I was a child, I had a teacher who made a difference in my life. It was right after my father died and I was lost. She noticed. She didn't just see my pain, she really saw me. And she did something about it. Eleanor swirled the glass between her fingers. I've always believed that sometimes all a child needs is one adult who listens, who believes, who stands up for them. Your children were suffering, asking for help in a way no one was hearing. I heard them. I couldn't just ignore it. You are an extraordinary person, Eleanor Vance. I just did what any decent person would do. No, Julian shook his head. Not just anyone. Most would have ignored the signs or rationalized them, or simply walked away from the situation to avoid trouble. You faced the problem head-on with no guarantees, without knowing the consequences. Eleanor didn't know how to respond. A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched the stars, each lost in their own thoughts. What happens now? Eleanor finally asked. With you, with the children? Julian sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Eleanor now recognized as characteristic. Honestly, I don't know. I need to rethink everything. My life, my priorities, how I've been raising my children. I've realized that even before Victoria, I was already failing them in some way. How so? I was so busy building an empire to leave them as an inheritance that I forgot to build what really mattered. Memories, trust, emotional security. He stared at his own glass as if he could find answers there. Isabel took care of that. She was the glue that held our family together. When she was gone, I tried to compensate by offering material things, financial stability. And now I understand that I need to be present. Truly present. He looked at Eleanor with renewed intensity. And that's why I have a request to make of you. Not as an employer, but as a father who is trying to fix his mistakes. Eleanor felt a strange flutter in her stomach. What request? Stay. Not just as a nanny, but as a pedagogical director for the triplets. Help me create an environment of learning, growth, and healing for them. Here in this house, without boarding schools or separations. The proposal caught Eleanor completely off guard. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Julian insisted. The triplets trust you in a way they don't trust anyone else right now. You understand what they've been through. You know how to help them overcome it. And frankly, he smiled slightly, I think I also need someone to teach me how to be a better father. Eleanor felt the weight of the decision. It wasn't just a job he was offering, but a complete life change, a total immersion into a family that was still wounded in the process of healing. It was an immense responsibility. I need to think, she replied honestly. Of course, Julian nodded understandingly. Take all the time you need. Later, alone in her room, Eleanor contemplated the proposal. She thought of her small flat in Camden, the school where she taught, the simple but meaningful life she had built. She thought of the triplets, Leo with his natural leadership, Noah with his artistic sensitivity, Sophie with her imagination and courage. She thought of Julian, a powerful man rediscovering the meaning of family. It was a crossroads she had never expected to encounter when she accepted that temporary job as a nanny. Now her decision could change not only her own life, but the lives of 4 other people who in just 2 days had already become inexplicably important to her. On the chest of drawers beside her bed, the heart-shaped shell Sophie had given her gleamed in the moonlight, a silent reminder of what was truly at stake. A week passed since the disastrous non-wedding. The Davenport mansion, which should have been the scene of nuptial festivities, had transformed into a silent refuge, a protective cocoon for a family in recovery. Eleanor had not yet given her definitive answer to Julian's proposal, but in practice, she had already assumed the role he had suggested. Every day she established an educational routine for the triplets, not a rigid study schedule, but a flexible program that combined learning, therapy, and most importantly, reconnection. On that sunny morning, Eleanor was organizing materials on the veranda she had turned into a makeshift classroom. 3 small tables were arranged in a semicircle, facing a mobile whiteboard. On each table were new notebooks, colored pencils, and small pots with plants that the children themselves had chosen to care for. Hardy succulents for Leo, colorful flowers for Sophie, and a bonsai tree for Noah. Can I help? Julian's voice surprised her. He was standing at the entrance to the veranda, holding a tray with coffee, bread, and fruit. Good morning, Eleanor smiled. I didn't expect to see you so early. I thought you had a video conference with Singapore today. I cancelled it, he replied simply, placing the tray on a side table. I realized I was falling into the same pattern. Work first, family later. That's not how I want to rebuild our life. Eleanor nodded, understanding the depth of the change that this seemingly simple decision represented for a man who had built an empire based on constant availability and absolute commitment to business. Are the triplets still asleep? Yes, I stopped by their room to check on them before coming down. Julian poured a cup of coffee for Eleanor and one for himself. What are you planning to teach today? Actually, it's not exactly a traditional lesson. We're working on a special project. What kind of project? A book, Eleanor explained, showing 3 colorful notebooks on her table. Each of them is writing and illustrating their own story. It's a form of narrative therapy, recommended by Dr. Foster. The child psychologist, Dr. Helen Foster, had been working intensively with the children over the past few days. An energetic and affectionate woman in her 50s, she had won the triplets' trust with an approach that combined professionalism and genuine warmth. "And how has it been?" Julian asked, sitting on one of the small chairs, looking comically large in it. "Are they talking about what happened?" "In their own way," Eleanor replied, choosing her words carefully. "Leo is writing about 3 explorers lost in an enchanted forest. Noah, about 3 birds trapped in an invisible cage. And Sophie." "And Sophie?" Julian prompted when Eleanor hesitated. "Sophie is writing about a princess who saves the king from a wicked witch who cast a spell on him so he couldn't see what was right in front of him." Julian closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the impact of the childish metaphors that were, in fact, deeply symbolic processings of the trauma they had experienced. "She sees me as someone who needed to be saved." "She sees you as someone good who was deceived," Eleanor corrected gently. "There's an important difference there. The children don't blame you, Julian. They understand in their own way that you were also a victim of manipulation." Before Julian could reply, they heard childish voices approaching. The triplets entered, the veranda hand in hand, a habit they had developed since the rescue, as if they needed constant physical contact to feel safe. "Good morning," exclaimed Sophie, the first to regain some of her natural liveliness. She ran to hug Eleanor and then her father. Leo and Noah followed, more reserved but equally affectionate. There was a new dynamic between father and children, a mutual care, a renewed attention to small signs and needs. "Is Daddy joining the lesson today?" asked Leo, noticing that Julian was sitting in one of the study chairs. "If you'd like him to," Eleanor replied, looking at Julian with a raised eyebrow in silent question. "I'd love to," he confirmed, sounding genuinely excited by the idea. "I might even try to write my own story." "But you already know how to write," Noah observed pragmatically. "You don't need lessons." "Everyone always has something new to learn," Julian replied with a smile. "And I think I have a lot to learn from you 3. After a light breakfast on the veranda, the lessons began. Eleanor had a natural gift for teaching. She knew when to direct and when to allow for free exploration, when to offer help, and when to let them find solutions on their own. Julian watched, fascinated by the interaction between her and his children, recognizing a harmony that he himself was still struggling to regain. "Aunt Catherine called last night," Leo commented casually, while coloring an illustration for his story. "She said she's coming to visit us next week." Julian exchanged a quick glance with Eleanor. Catherine had decided to cut her European trip short after the incident, insisting she wanted to be present to support the family. It was a development that left Eleanor with mixed feelings. On one hand, more family support was always welcome. On the other, she was beginning to feel inexplicably protective of the unit they had formed in recent weeks. "It will be great to see Aunt Catherine," Julian replied. "She's missed you all very much." "She'll like Eleanor," Sophie stated with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Everyone likes Eleanor. The afternoon passed peacefully, with the children immersed in their creative projects. When they finished, each read a passage from their story to the others. Noah, normally the most reserved, surprised everyone with the richness of detail in his narrative about the captive birds who discover they can sing so loudly that the invisible walls of their cage begin to crack. "How did the birds know that singing would break the cage?" Julian asked when his son finished reading. Noah considered the question seriously. "They didn't know," he replied finally. "They were singing because they were sad and scared. But then they discovered that their song was stronger than the fear." Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. In her few weeks as their educational guide, she had learned that sometimes the most profound insights came from the youngest minds, expressed with a simplicity that no adult could replicate. After dinner, when the children were in their rooms getting ready for bed, Julian invited Eleanor for a walk through the gardens. The evening was mild, with a gentle breeze from the sea and a sky so starry it seemed impossible in any big city. "You're extraordinary with them," Julian commented as they walked along a path lit by small solar lamps. "I've never seen them so engaged, so present." "They are remarkable children," Eleanor replied. "Intelligent, sensitive, resilient, And they've had a strong example, you. Julian shook his head in disbelief. Me? The man who didn't notice his own children were missing for a week? The father who almost sent them to a boarding school abroad without even discussing it with them? The man who is doing everything he can to fix his mistakes, Eleanor corrected firmly. The father who cancelled an important international meeting to attend a makeshift lesson. The person who is relearning to prioritize what truly matters. He stopped walking, turning to face her under the soft moonlight. How do you do it? See the best in people even when they can't see it themselves? It's what I do as an educator, Eleanor replied simply. I see potential where others see limitations. Julian studied her for a long moment, as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. Have you thought about my proposal? The question, though expected, still caught her by surprise. I've been thinking about something else, she said, slightly deflecting the subject. The children will need to resume formal studies eventually. We're in the middle of the school year. And even with personalized tutoring, they need structure, socialization, routine. I agree. I've been researching schools in the area. There are some excellent ones in and around Cornwall. Actually, Eleanor took a deep breath, I was thinking of something different. What if we hired other teachers and created a small educational center right here, at least for now? A place where the triplets can learn at their own pace in a safe environment, but also socialize with other carefully selected children. Julian blinked, surprised. To a school, here on the estate. Not exactly a formal school, more like an experimental learning hub, Eleanor explained, her enthusiasm growing as she verbalized the idea she had been quietly cultivating for days. We could adapt the east wing of the mansion, the one you mentioned you rarely use, hire specialized teachers to complement what I can offer, maybe even open it up to a few other children from the local community or the children of your employees. You've really thought this through, Julian observed, a smile beginning to form on his lips. It's just an idea. Eleanor toned it down, suddenly insecure. Probably too complicated, too expensive. It's brilliant, Julian interrupted. Absolutely brilliant. The triplets would have the safety and personalized attention they need right now, but also the socialization necessary for their development. And it would be a way of giving something back to the community. He took her hands in his, squeezing them enthusiastically. Eleanor Vance, you have just created the Davenport Educational Project, and, if you accept my proposal, I want you to direct it, with full pedagogical autonomy and all the necessary resources. Eleanor felt a wave of emotion so intense she could barely speak. It was more than she had ever dreamed of, the chance to implement everything she believed in as an educator, without the bureaucratic limitations of the traditional system. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Julian insisted, still holding her hands. Say you'll stay, that you'll help us build something new from the broken pieces. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that Eleanor had never seen before. It wasn't just an employer making a professional offer, but a man asking for help to rebuild much more than an educational project. Yes, she replied finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I'll stay. The smile that lit up Julian's face was like the sunrise, a complete transformation of his normally serious features into something radiant and open. For a moment, Eleanor thought he was going to hug her, but he just squeezed her hands more firmly before letting them go. You won't regret it. I promise you'll have everything you need to make this project a success. I'm not worried about that, she replied honestly. I'm more interested in seeing the triplets flourish. They continued walking through the garden, now excitedly discussing the practical details of the project, spaces, timeline, curriculum, potential teachers. It was as if a spark had been lit between them, a harmony of purpose and vision that turned ideas into concrete possibilities. When they returned to the mansion, Eleanor went up to check on the children. She found them already asleep, the three of them sharing the huge king-size bed in the master bedroom, as they had been doing since the incident. Leo was in the middle, a protective arm over each of his siblings, even in sleep. The scene moved her deeply. She thought about how she had arrived here, a simple teacher hired as an emergency nanny, now about to embark on a journey that would transform not only her own life, but potentially the education of many children. In her own room, Eleanor began to sketch out ideas for the project in her notebook. She was so engrossed that she barely noticed the time pass. A light knock on the door brought her back to reality. "Still awake?" Julian asked when she opened the door. He was holding 2 steaming mugs. "Hot chocolate," he explained, offering her one of the mugs. "My mother always said the best ideas come over a mug of hot chocolate." Eleanor accepted the drink with a smile, savoring the comforting aroma of chocolate and cinnamon. "Thank you. I was just making some drafts for the project. May I see?" She hesitated briefly before stepping aside, silently inviting him in. Julian stopped in the center of the room, clearly aware that he was entering her personal space. "May I sit?" he asked, indicating an armchair near the desk where Eleanor was working. "Of course." She showed him the drafts, diagrams of spaces, lists of subjects, methodologies, schedules. Julian examined everything with genuine interest, asking insightful questions and offering practical suggestions. "Impressive," he commented, handing back the notebook. "You really understand education." "It's my passion," Eleanor admitted. "I've always believed we can do better for our children. Create learning environments that respect their individuality and pace." "Isabel would have loved to meet you," Julian said suddenly, a touch of melancholy in his voice. She was also passionate about education. She was always questioning the traditional system, especially after we discovered that Noah is dyslexic. "Noah is dyslexic?" Eleanor frowned, surprised she hadn't noticed. "He reads very well for a child with dyslexia." Isabel developed her own method to help him. She would spend hours with him, turning learning into games. That's why he loves stories so much. Books were a challenge he overcame with his mother. There was a softness in Julian's voice when he spoke of his late wife that touched Eleanor deeply. It wasn't the bitter grief she had seen in her own mother, but a serene gratitude for the time they had shared. "You still love her," Eleanor observed, without accusation or jealousy, simply stating a fact. "I always will," Julian confirmed. "Isabel was my first love, the mother of my children, my partner for 15 years. He paused, looking at the starry sky visible through the open window. "But I learned the hard way that trying to replace her was my biggest mistake. Victoria—" "We don't have to talk about her," Eleanor interrupted gently. "No, it's all right. It's part of the healing process, isn't it?" Julian smiled sadly. "Victoria seemed so different from Isabel that I thought it would be safe. There would be no comparisons, no shadows. What I didn't realize was that I was looking in the wrong place. I didn't need someone different from or the same as Isabel. I needed someone authentic, with integrity." He looked directly at Eleanor, and something in the intensity of his gaze made her blush slightly. "Someone like you," he finished softly. Eleanor felt her heart race. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn, entering territory she wasn't yet sure she wanted to explore. "Julian, I'm not declaring my love for you," he quickly reassured her, a touch of humor in his voice. "That would be inappropriate and premature, considering everything. I'm just acknowledging that you possess qualities I should have valued more, that I should have sought in anyone who entered my family's life." Eleanor relaxed a little, relieved by the clarification. "I understand, and I appreciate the acknowledgement. However," Julian continued, his gaze still fixed on her, "I can't promise that I'm not attracted to you, Eleanor. That would be dishonest. But I do promise to respect the professional boundaries we establish. The triplets' well-being and the success of the educational project are the absolute priorities." His frankness completely disarmed her. It was refreshing after Victoria's manipulations and half-truths. "I appreciate your honesty," Eleanor replied after a moment of reflection, "and I share the same priorities." It was not a direct rejection, nor was it an encouragement, and they both knew it. It was a mutual recognition that something existed between them, something that, at the right time, might be explored. Julian nodded, understanding what had been left unsaid. He stood up, preparing to leave. "Good night, Eleanor. Thank you for the hot chocolate." "I was the one who got the chocolate," she smiled. "Ah," he blinked. "But I received something far more valuable: hope." When the door closed behind him, Eleanor returned to her desk, looking at the plans for the educational project. But her mind was wandering, no longer focused solely on the practical aspects, but on the possibilities opening up before her: professional, personal, emotional possibilities. Possibilities she had never even imagined when she accepted that temporary job as a nanny. The heart-shaped shell Sophie had given her rested beside her drafts, a symbol of the unexpected gift that life sometimes offers when we least expect it. The chance to make a difference, to build something meaningful, to find a place to call home. 3 months passed with the speed that only time filled with purpose can achieve. The east wing of the Davenport mansion, once a set of little-used rooms, had sprung to new life. Walls had been knocked down to create spacious, light-filled spaces. Colorful, ergonomic school furniture had replaced the old classic pieces, and children's art murals decorated once austere corridors. The Isabel Davenport Learning Center, named in honor of the triplets' late mother, had been officially running for 6 weeks. In addition to Leo, Noah, and Sophie, 12 other children attended the space. Children of employees from Julian's hotel chain, local children selected through a scholarship program, and a few children of close family friends. On that sunny Friday morning, Eleanor watched with satisfaction as the science class took place in the experimental garden. Noah, once so shy and withdrawn, was excitedly explaining the irrigation system he had developed for the vegetable patch, assisted by Leo, who was methodically organizing the other students into work groups. "The difference in just 3 months is unbelievable," a female voice commented beside her. Catherine Montero, Julian's sister-in-law and the triplets' aunt, watched the scene with evident admiration. At 40, she maintained a natural elegance that was reminiscent of photographs of her late sister. Since returning from Europe, she had been spending more and more time at the mansion, helping with the educational project and reconnecting with her niece and nephews. Children have an incredible capacity for recovery when they receive the right support. Eleanor replied, "I'm not just talking about the children," Catherine smiled. "Julian too. I've never seen him so present, so connected." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Julian appeared in the courtyard, carrying a large glass aquarium. He was greeted with enthusiastic exclamations from the children, who immediately surrounded the new item for their aquatic ecosystems lesson. "Daddy!" Sophie ran to him, her dark curls bouncing with every step. "Did you bring the fish too?" "They're on their way," Julian replied, carefully placing the aquarium on a table prepared for the activity. "Professor Fisher is bringing them from the specialist shop now." Daniel Fisher, a marine biologist recruited by Eleanor for the project, was just one of the 5 specialized teachers who now made up the center's team. Each had been selected not only for their academic expertise, but also for their humanized approach to education. "He's transformed their lives," Catherine observed, her eyes following Julian as he knelt to listen attentively to Noah's explanation of the irrigation system. "And they've transformed his. It's a two-way street," Eleanor agreed. "Julian has found a new purpose, a new way to lead, not just by commanding from the top, but by actively participating. And you've played a fundamental role in all of this," Catherine added, turning to face her directly. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for my family, Eleanor." There was a sincerity in Catherine's voice that touched Eleanor deeply. In the first few weeks after her arrival, she had feared that the triplets' aunt might see her as an intruder, someone trying to occupy a space that didn't belong to her. But Catherine had proven to be surprisingly welcoming and grateful, acknowledging without resentment the special bond Eleanor had developed with the children. "I just did what needed to be done," Eleanor replied, her usual mantra. "No, you did much more," Catherine insisted. "You put yourself at risk for children you barely knew. You created this incredible place. And you brought Julian back to us." She paused meaningfully. Back to himself, really. Before Eleanor could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Daniel, carrying several plastic bags with small, colorful fish. The children immediately migrated to the new point of interest, allowing Julian to approach the 2 women. "How are we today, ladies?" he asked, a relaxed smile on his sun-tanned face, the result of the many hours he now spent outdoors with his children. "Impressed with the center's progress," Catherine replied. "And with yours," Julian laughed, unashamed by his sister-in-law's direct observation. "I have good examples to follow," he said, his gaze briefly meeting Eleanor's before returning to Catherine. "I remembered something Isabel always used to say. True wealth is the time we invest in the people we love. She would be proud, Catherine stated, emotion showing in her voice. Very proud of the father you've become. A call from Professor Fisher interrupted the moment, summoning everyone for the formal start of the aquatic ecosystem activity. For the next hour, children and adults immersed themselves, literally in the case of eager hands, in the fascinating world of miniature marine habitats. At the end of the lesson, as the children headed for lunch in the newly built dining hall, Mrs. Gable appeared in the courtyard, her usually serious expression marked by concern. "Mr. Davenport, do you have a moment?" she asked, casting a significant glance at Eleanor and Catherine. "Of course, Mrs. Gable, what is it?" The housekeeper hesitated, clearly uncomfortable speaking in front of everyone. "It's about Miss Sterling," she finally said, almost whispering the name. "The hearing has been scheduled. It's next week." A heavy silence fell over the group. Victoria Sterling was facing criminal proceedings for her crimes against the triplets, but until now, she had managed to delay the legal process with maneuvers from her lawyers. "I see," Julian replied, his expression suddenly grave. "I'll be in my study in 10 minutes. Please ask Mr. Davies to call me." As Mrs. Gable withdrew, Catherine touched her brother-in-law's arm. "Will the children have to testify?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "We will do everything to avoid it," Julian replied firmly. "Mr. Davies has assured me there are alternatives, recorded depositions in a protected environment, psychological reports instead of direct testimony. We can't let them relive that trauma in a courtroom," Eleanor added. "They are finally moving forward, regaining trust, security." Julian nodded, massaging his temples as he did when under pressure. "That's exactly what I told the prosecutor. Their progress is fragile, too precious to risk." "I'll stay with the children while you sort this out," Catherine offered, always practical. "They shouldn't sense your worry." "Not yet." As Catherine headed to the dining hall, Eleanor and Julian remained in the now silent courtyard, both lost in thought about what the hearing could mean for the family that had fought so hard to heal. "I don't want them to see her again," Julian finally said, his voice low and intense. "Not even in a courtroom." "What Victoria did?" "I know," Eleanor replied, instinctively touching his arm in a comforting gesture. "But I also know you'll do what's best to protect them. And you're not alone in this." Julian covered her hand with his, holding it firmly. "I'm not, am I?" The look they exchanged contained far more than words could express. Gratitude, trust, and something deeper that both still hesitated to name. The rest of the afternoon passed with apparent normality, but Eleanor could feel the underlying tension in Julian during the school activities. When the school day ended and the other children were picked up by their guardians, the triplets ran to show their father their work. "Look, Daddy, I drew a picture of our aquarium." Sophie held out a colorful sheet of paper, showing creatively shaped fish swimming in an environment filled with aquatic plants and small underwater structures. "It's beautiful." "Princess," Julian praised, genuinely impressed by his daughter's artistic talent. "We can frame it for your room." "Actually," Sophie replied, blushing slightly, "I made it as a present for Eleanor." Eleanor felt a wave of emotion as she received the drawing from the little girl's hands. "It's the most beautiful present I've ever received," she said sincerely. "I'll keep it forever along with the shell." Sophie smiled, satisfied, and ran to join her brothers, who were now showing Julian a model volcano they had built with the geology teacher. Later, after dinner and the triplets' bedtime routine, which now included shared reading, followed by a moment to record 3 good things from the day in personalized journals, a recommendation from Dr. Foster to strengthen feelings of security. Eleanor found Julian in the mansion's library. He was sitting in a leather armchair, an untouched glass of whiskey on the table beside him, reviewing documents that Eleanor recognized as related to the court case. "How are things?" she asked, accepting the silent invitation to sit in the opposite armchair. "Complicated," he replied, closing the folder. "Victoria has hired one of the most renowned criminal defense lawyers in the country. They're trying to downplay the charges, claiming altered emotional state and lack of intent to cause permanent harm." "That's absurd," Eleanor exclaimed, indignant. She meticulously planned every step. "The emails, the falsified documents for the boarding school." "I know. And we have the proof." Julian ran a hand through his hair. a gesture Eleanor now identified as a sign of his frustration. But the legal system has its complexities, and she comes from an influential family with connections. This can't go unpunished, Julian. It won't, he assured her, with a firmness that reminded Eleanor of the determined businessman she had met months ago. I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure she is held accountable, not just for what she did to my children, but so that no other child is at risk of going through the same thing. Eleanor nodded, recognizing the determination in his eyes. And what about the triplets? Will they need to know about the hearing? Dr. Foster suggested we be transparent, but in a controlled way, Julian explained. Not to mention the details of the proceedings, just to explain that justice is handling the case and that Victoria can never hurt them again. That sounds sensible. Children are more perceptive than we imagine. If they sense we're hiding something, they might create even worse scenarios in their minds. They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who no longer need to fill every moment with words. Through the open library window, the soft sound of waves breaking on the private beach created a soothing soundtrack. 3 months, Julian commented after a few moments, a touch of disbelief in his voice. It feels like a lifetime since that day at the altar. In many ways it was a lifetime, Eleanor replied. You all were reborn from that moment. Julian stood up, walking to the window to watch the night sea. Do you know what haunts me the most? He asked without turning. It's not what Victoria did, although that's unforgivable. It's that I allowed it. Not because I agreed, but because I was so focused on building a new, perfect family that I stopped seeing what was right in front of me, the real, imperfect family I already had. Perfection is overrated, Eleanor commented, joining him at the window, especially when it comes to human relationships. I learned that the hard way. Julian turned to face her, his gaze intense even in the dim light of the library, lit only by lamps. But I also learned that there are people who, even without seeking perfection, manage to bring out the best in us. Eleanor's heart sped up at his words and their proximity. Over the past few months they had developed a solid partnership, professional, friendly and increasingly charged with an unresolved tension that both carefully avoided naming. Julian, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I know we've set professional boundaries. I know the center, the triplets, their recovery are the priorities. And I respect that deeply. Yes, they are priorities, Eleanor agreed. But also... A light knock on the library door interrupted them. Catherine appeared, looking slightly embarrassed to be interrupting the moment. Sorry, Sophie had a nightmare. She's asking for both of you. Immediately, all other considerations were set aside. Julian and Eleanor followed Catherine to the girls' room. The triplets now slept in separate rooms, though interconnected by doors that remained open at night, a gradual transition recommended by the psychologist. Sophie was sitting up in bed, her eyes red and her face tear-stained. When she saw her father and Eleanor, she held out her arms in a silent plea for comfort. She came back in my dream, the girl said as Julian hugged her. She said she was going to take us away again. It was just a dream, sweetie, Julian soothed her, stroking her hair. She can't hurt you or your brothers again. I'm here. Eleanor is here. Aunt Catherine is here. We're all here to protect you, Eleanor added, sitting on the edge of the bed. Sophie reached out a hand to hold hers, while the other remained firmly clasped in her father's. Can I sleep with you guys tonight? She asked, her voice small and vulnerable. Julian and Eleanor exchanged a quick glance. Surprised by the phrasing of the question, with you guys, not just with her father, how about I stay here with you until you fall asleep? Eleanor offered, noticing that Leo and Noah were now watching from the interconnecting doorway, clearly awakened by the commotion. Me too, Julian added. We'll all get settled in here and tell stories until sleep comes back. Within minutes, all 5 of them were snuggled on Sophie's bed, Julian leaning against the headboard with his daughter in his lap, Noah and Leo curled up on either side, and Eleanor sitting at the foot of the bed, telling a story about a family of sea turtles who navigated the oceans always together, facing storms and finding new friends. Catherine, watching from the door, smiled at the scene before quietly retreating. There was a certainty growing in her heart. These people were not just a widowed father, 3 traumatized children, and a dedicated educator. They were, in every sense that mattered, a family. When the children finally fell asleep, Julian and Eleanor quietly left the room, leaving the door ajar and the hallway light on, as had become their habit since the incident. "Thank you," Julian said when they were in the corridor, "for everything." "You don't need to thank me." "No, I do," he insisted. When Sophie said, "Sleep with you guys," I realized something I may have been trying not to see. To them, you're not just the teacher or the director of the center. You are, he paused, searching for the right words, you've become an essential part of their lives, of our life. Eleanor felt the weight of those words, the acknowledgement of something she herself had been noticing in recent weeks. It wasn't just the center that kept her there, nor just the responsibility she felt for the triplets. It was something more, something that had grown organically among them all. "You've all become an essential part of my life too," she replied honestly. The look they exchanged held unspoken promises, of future conversations, of unexplored possibilities, of feelings that perhaps, after the approaching judicial storm, could finally be acknowledged aloud. For now, on that quiet night in the seaside mansion, it was enough to know that they had found in each other something none of them had expected when it all began. A sense of belonging, a new chance, a home. The day of the hearing dawned with a sky heavy with grey clouds, as if the weather itself acknowledged the gravity of the moment. Julian left early for the Cornwall Crown Court, accompanied by Mr. Davies and a team of lawyers. Eleanor would stay at the mansion with the triplets, keeping them busy and, as much as possible, oblivious to the tension that hung over the adults. "I called the school and told them our students will have a special environmental project day," Eleanor explained at breakfast, when Leo questioned why the center wouldn't be running as usual. "The three of you will be my special assistants today." The triplets accepted the explanation without much question, a sign of the trust they had rebuilt with the adults in their lives. There were still moments of insecurity, occasional nightmares, difficult questions, but the progress was undeniable. The sessions with Dr. Foster, combined with the stable and affectionate routine Julian and Eleanor had established, had produced results that seemed miraculous to anyone who had seen the children's state 4 months earlier. The morning was filled with activities in the newly built greenhouse at the back of the property, a joint project by Eleanor and Julian to teach the children about sustainability and the life cycle of plants. The triplets, excited by the responsibility of being special assistants, dedicated themselves completely to planting native British woodland saplings. "Will these trees grow taller than the mansion?" asked Noah, watching with fascination the tiny rowan sapling he had just planted. "Much taller," Eleanor confirmed. "Rowan trees can reach 15 meters in height, but it takes time. Years, decades, like people growing up," suggested Sophie, always perceptive in her analogies. "Exactly like people," Eleanor smiled. "With constant care, proper nutrition, and space to expand, both trees and people can reach surprising heights. We'll take care of them every day," decided Leo, assuming his leadership role. "So they grow strong and healthy." Eleanor watched the three of them with a mixture of pride and admiration. How they had transformed from those scared, malnourished and traumatized children she had found hidden behind a wall. Leo now channeled his protective nature into leading constructive projects, instead of just watching over his siblings against invisible threats. Noah had discovered in art and nature ways to express his sensitivity without fear of judgment. And Sophie, little Sophie, had turned her traumatic experience into a source of extraordinary empathy, often being the first to notice when another child at the center needed support or comfort. Eleanor's mobile phone vibrated in the pocket of her gardening apron. It was a message from Julian. It started, "Victoria is present with 3 lawyers. Keep the children busy. I'll call as soon as I can." Eleanor felt a tightness in her chest. Despite all the legal preparations, all the evidence, all the testimonies, there was still that irrational fear that somehow Victoria Sterling might escape the consequences, or worse, somehow threaten the triplets again. "Is everything okay, Eleanor?" asked Sophie, always attentive to the adults' moods. "Everything's great," Eleanor replied, forcing a smile. "I was just thinking about the special lunch Mrs. Gable is preparing for our hard-working gardeners." The mention of food effectively distracted the children, and soon they were speculating about the menu while continuing their planting work. Eleanor breathed a sigh of relief at the successful diversion, but noticed that Leo was watching her with an expression that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. After lunch, a delicious meal that Mrs. Gable had truly outdone herself on, as if she too wanted to do her part to keep the day positive, Eleanor took the children to the private beach. The sky had begun to clear, and although the sea was too rough for swimming, the sand offered endless possibilities for play. "Let's build a whole city," proposed Noah, already starting to dig the foundations of what promised to be an elaborate sand construction. While the boys focused on the architecture of their sandy city, Sophie sat next to Eleanor under the parasol. "Daddy's at the courthouse today, isn't he?" she asked without preamble, surprising Eleanor with her perception. Eleanor hesitated. Dr. Foster had advised age-appropriate honesty when the children asked direct questions. Lying, even with good intentions, would only reinforce the idea that they couldn't trust adults. "Yes, Sophie. Your dad is at the courthouse." The girl nodded, processing the information with a maturity that sometimes broke Eleanor's heart. "It's about her, isn't it?" "Aunt Victoria." "It is, sweetie. The court is deciding what will happen to her for what she did to you." Sophie drew circles in the sand with her finger, thoughtful. "Is she going to prison?" "Probably, yes. What she did was very serious." "I get scared sometimes," Sophie admitted in a low voice so her brothers wouldn't hear, scared that she'll escape and come back. Eleanor put an arm around the girl's shoulders, pulling her close. "It's normal to feel scared after what you've been through, but your dad, me, Aunt Catherine, all of us are here to protect you, and the justice system will make sure she can never hurt anyone again." Sophie rested her head on Eleanor's shoulder, a gesture of trust that was worth more than 1,000 words. "You're never going to leave, are you, Eleanor?" she asked after a moment of silence. The question struck Eleanor at the core of her being. 4 months ago, when she accepted the job as a nanny, she could never have imagined how much her life would become intertwined with the Davenport family. The learning center was only part of it. The bond she had developed with the triplets, the partnership with Julian, the friendship with Catherine, all of it had become so fundamental to her existence that the idea of leaving seemed inconceivable. "No," she replied with absolute certainty. "I'm not leaving." Sophie smiled, satisfied, and turned her attention back to her brothers, shouting suggestions for the construction of the Sand City. Eleanor remained seated, watching the 3 children who against all odds had found a path to healing. Her phone vibrated again. Another message from Julian. "Lunch break. Evidence is overwhelming. Victoria tried for a plea deal, but the prosecution refused. The judge seems to be leaning in our favor." Eleanor let out a sigh of relief. It wasn't over yet, but the signs were promising. The afternoon progressed with board games on the veranda, an impromptu cinema session with the new animated film the triplets loved, and finally, a surprise video conference with Aunt Catherine, who was in London on business but made sure to keep in daily contact with her niece and nephews. "How are my little scientists?" Catherine asked, her smiling face filling the tablet screen. "We planted trees today," exclaimed Noah, leaning in to be clearly visible on camera. "Trees that will grow taller than the mansion." "And we built a city on the beach," added Leo, "with streets, squares, and even a harbor." "That sounds like a wonderful day," Catherine replied, her eyes meeting Eleanor's over the children's heads. There was a silent question there, which Eleanor answered with a slight nod. Everything was fine so far. "Aunt Catherine," Sophie leaned closer to the camera, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret, "Daddy's at the courthouse today." Catherine hesitated for only a second, her gaze again meeting Eleanor's before she answered. "I know, sweetie. He's doing a very important job there." "To make sure she never hurts anyone again," Sophie completed, repeating Eleanor's words. "Eleanor said we don't need to be scared." "And Eleanor is absolutely right," Catherine confirmed firmly. "You are safe now. Forever." When the call ended, the sun was beginning to set, painting the Cornwall sky with shades of orange and pink that reflected on the bay's waters. The children, tired from their day of activities, were unusually quiet during dinner. "When is Dad coming back?" asked Noah, playing with the rice on his plate. "Soon," Eleanor replied, checking the clock. The hearing should have ended an hour ago, but she hadn't received any updates from Julian. Perhaps there was a delay at the court. As if summoned by her words, The sound of a car at the mansion's entrance reached the dining room. The triplets immediately jumped from their seats, running to the main entrance. Eleanor followed them, her heart racing with anticipation. Julian walked through the door looking exhausted, but with a determined glint in his eyes. He was immediately surrounded by his children, who clung to his legs and waist like little koalas, bombarding him with questions about his day and reporting their own activities in a childish cacophony. He laughed, crouching down to hug all three at once. Easy, easy. One at a time, please. Let your dad breathe. Over the triplets' heads, his eyes met Eleanor's, who had remained slightly back to allow for the family moment. With a small nod, he indicated they had much to discuss, but that the news was good. How about we finish dinner? Eleanor suggested. Then you can show your dad all the photos we took of our activities today. The children agreed enthusiastically, pulling Julian towards the dining room. The rest of the meal passed in a much lighter atmosphere, the triplets competing for their father's attention, each determined to share the most important details of their day. When it was finally time to put the children to bed, after baths, teeth brushing, story time, and the 3 good things of the day journal ritual, Eleanor and Julian found themselves on the second-floor veranda, both exhausted but relieved to have reached the end of that significant day. So? Eleanor asked, accepting the glass of wine he offered her. Julian let out a deep sigh, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she now found both familiar and endearingly characteristic of him. She's going to prison, he replied simply. 5 to 8 years, with no possibility of parole in the first year, due to the severity of the case and the involvement of minors. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, a wave of relief washing over her. The testimonies were crucial, Julian continued. Yours, Mrs. Gables, the medical and psychological reports on the children's condition when they were found, and, of course, the emails, the falsified documents, everything. How did she react? Coldly at first. She maintained that controlled, almost arrogant posture, insisting it was a misunderstanding, that she never intended to cause real harm. Julian took a sip of wine. But when the judge started reading the evidence, especially the details about the children's physical condition when they were found, something seemed to break. I don't think it was genuine remorse, more like the realization that there was no way out. And you? How do you feel? Julian contemplated the question for a moment, looking at the horizon where the sea merged with the night sky. Relieved. Not for revenge, but because I can finally assure my children that they are truly safe. He turned to face her. And grateful. To you for what you did, for the person you are, Eleanor. Felt the warmth rise to her face under the intensity of his gaze. I've already told you I only did what any decent person would do. And I've already told you I disagree, he retorted with a small smile. Which reminds me, there's something I want to show you, something I've been working on for the past few weeks. Intrigued, Eleanor followed him through the mansion to the east wing, where the learning center operated. Instead of entering through the main door, Julian led her down a side path to an area that had been under construction when the project began, but which Eleanor hadn't visited recently. Absorbed in coordinating the pedagogical activities. Close your eyes, he instructed, positioning himself behind her. Eleanor obeyed, feeling Julian's hands on her shoulders, guiding her gently forward. She heard the sound of a door opening, felt the change in the air, an indoor space with the scent of fresh paint and new wood. You can open them now. Eleanor opened her eyes and gasped. She was in a library. Not an ordinary library, but something straight out of her most ambitious dreams. Floor-to-ceiling noble wood shelves covered 3 of the walls, already partially filled with books organized by category. The 4th wall was all glass, offering a spectacular view of the bay. In the center, a set of study tables of different sizes formed a flexible configuration. In one corner, colorful beanbags created a cozy, informal reading space. In another, a tech table with modern tablets and computers completed the environment. Julian, this is incredible, she stammered, turning slowly to take in every detail. The Eleanor Vance Library, he announced with evident satisfaction. The heart of the Isabel Davenport Learning Center. Eleanor stopped turning, staring at him in surprise. My name? But why? The whole center is already named after Isabel, as it should be. And the library is named after you, as it should be. Julian interrupted gently. It was you who brought new life to this house, Eleanor. Who showed all of us that learning isn't just about facts and figures, but about connections, growth, healing. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, too moved to respond. There's one more thing, he continued, guiding her to a side door she hadn't noticed initially. When Julian opened the door, Eleanor saw an elegant and functional office, with a spacious desk, its own bookshelves, a small meeting table, and, surprisingly, a comfortable sofa in one corner. Your new office, he explained, as the official pedagogical director of the center. And there's an extra surprise. He opened a second door inside the office, revealing a small, complete flat, a living room, a compact kitchen, a bedroom and a bathroom, all decorated with taste and attention to detail. For when the work nights get long, Julian explained at her perplexed expression, are written for when you want a space of your own even while being close by. Julian, I don't know what to say, Eleanor confessed, touching the doorframe as if she needed to confirm it was real. It's perfect. All of it. There's one more thing. He suddenly seemed nervous, a rare sight for the confident businessman. Something I've been wanting to say for weeks, maybe months, but the timing never seemed right. Eleanor felt her heart race as Julian took her hands in his. When you came into our lives, we were broken, my children and I, not just because of what Victoria did, but because of everything that came before. The loss of Isabel, my inability to properly process grief, to be truly present for the children. He paused, clearly organizing his thoughts. You didn't just save us in the literal sense, Eleanor. You taught us how to be a family again, to communicate, to truly listen, to be present for each other. His eyes met hers with intensity, and in the process, I think something happened that none of us planned. What? Eleanor asked, her voice almost a whisper. We fell in love with you, all of us in different ways, of course. He smiled slightly. The triplets see you as a mother figure, an anchor of safety and understanding. And he took a deep breath. I discovered something I thought I would never feel again after Isabel. Something that has nothing to do with replacement or filling voids, but with a new beginning, a new chance. Eleanor felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She knew what was coming, and yet she could hardly believe it. I'm not asking for an immediate answer, Julian continued. I know our story began in an unusual way, that there are complexities involved, the children, the center, your career. I just want you to know that what I feel for you is real, deep, and patient. I will wait as long as it takes. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words resonate within her. When she opened them again, there was a clarity that hadn't been there before. Do you know what Sophie asked me on the beach today? She said finally. She asked if I would ever leave, and I answered with absolute certainty that I wouldn't. And that means... Julian left the question hanging in the air, hope and vulnerability mixed in his gaze. It means I fell in love too, Eleanor replied simply, with 3 extraordinary children, and with a man who had the courage to admit his mistakes and work tirelessly to correct them. With a family that allowed me to be a part of it when I least expected it. The smile that lit up Julian's face was like the sunrise after the longest of nights. So, Eleanor Vance, would you accept not only to direct the Isabel Davenport Learning Center, but also to consider a future with us? As a family? Yes, she replied, feeling a certainty that transcended any doubt or fear. Yes to everything. When Julian kissed her, there in the middle of the library that bore her name, Eleanor felt as if her entire life had been a journey towards that precise moment. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, it was real. Complex, built on pain and healing, mistakes and redemption. That night, as they walked hand in hand back to the main mansion, where 3 children slept safely in their rooms, Eleanor thought about the extraordinary series of events that had brought her here. An emergency job offer, a manipulative fiancé, children trapped behind walls, an interrupted wedding. It could all have been a tragedy, were it not for something so simple and so profound, the human capacity to listen, to believe, to protect the most vulnerable. What are you thinking about? Julian asked, noticing her contemplative expression. About how unpredictable life is, she answered honestly. About how sometimes we have to lose everything to find what really matters. And what did we end up finding? Eleanor smiled, squeezing his hand in hers. A second chance. A new beginning. A home. As they entered the mansion that was now truly a home for all of them, the full moon illuminated the Cornwall Bay, its reflection creating a silver path across the water. Just as that light found its way through the darkness, so too had they, Julian, Eleanor, Leo, Noah, and Sophie, navigated the densest shadows to emerge on the other side, not perfect but whole, not without scars, but stronger because of them. And if there was one lesson to be learned from their entire journey, it was that sometimes the happiest endings don't come from pristine fairy tales, but from real, imperfect, and profoundly human stories. Stories of falling, of resilience, and finally of redemption. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Eleanor and the Davenport family has touched your hearts. To follow more emotional narratives like this one, we have prepared a special playlist that you can find by clicking the link on the left. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on the video. Every day we bring new stories that explore the complexities of life and human relationships. Don't miss our upcoming content and share your opinions in the comments. We look forward to hearing what you thought of this conclusion.